In this episode of Abolition Lessons, we explore the intricate connections between land justice, reparations, and abolition. We explore how historical sites of oppression are recycled into modern systems of control and the transformative potential of integrating land justice, geography, and the freedom of movement in abolitionist spaces. Welcome to Abolition Lessons here on the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Remember, there's no need to take an assigned seat. There will be no tests, no grades, and definitely no detention. All you need is an open mind. Class is now in session. Today, we will be learning about how freeing the land and freeing the people go hand in hand and the freedom of movement in abolitionist spaces. I'm Irene Franco Rubio, an activist, scholar, community organizer, and host of the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Just a reminder, Schools Not Prisons was founded in 2016 and is part of a larger movement to examine the history of the prison industrial complex and how oppression in all its forms has worked to criminalize young Black and brown people across the United States. We're centering abolitionist education for young people of color. We're exploring alternatives to incarceration, centering accountability, and co-creating a better world together. Okay. Before we get into today's interview, let's go over some vocabulary so we can really understand the story our guest is about to share with us. The first key term is land justice. As a movement, land justice seeks to upend the inherent inequalities that stem from land ownership and access, or lack thereof, by shifting power to marginalized communities, especially Black and Indigenous people, in order to promote their own self-determination. To me, land justice is about returning the land back to its original peoples. Our second key term is reparations. The National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America defines reparations as a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. To me, reparations is about addressing and paying back for the harms that have been inflicted upon ethnic communities. Today's guest is Brea Baker. She is a freedom fighter and writer, in that order, who has been working on the front lines for almost a decade, first as a student activist and now as a national and global strategist. In that time, she has contributed to dozens of electoral and advocacy campaigns, including the #NextYale movement to address the legacy of white supremacy on her campus, the 2017 Women's March, where she served as the youngest national organizer, the 2018 student walkouts against gun violence, Jermaine Williams' successful bid for NYC public advocate, and many more on behalf of police brutality victims and their families. Brea's book is titled Rooted: The American Legacy of Land Theft and the Modern Movement for Black Land Ownership. It dives into one of the nation's first sins, stealing and hoarding the land. I first met Brea upon reading about her work on what it meant to be an abolitionist. And she was actually my first introduction to what abolition meant and what it looked like, and how I and others too could be part of that movement. So I'm so excited to have her here today to share more about how she's come to develop her understanding of abolition and how it has informed my own. Content warning. This podcast may contain mention of racism and or police violence against adults and minors. Look for the Schools Not Prisons podcast on YouTube to find extended episodes, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for even more content. For being here. I'm so excited to finally see you in person after so long.
Yes.
It's such a pleasure, truly.
No, I'm so honored to be here. This is just such an amazing podcast, so I'm glad to be one of the guests.
So exciting. Well, yeah, can you share with us a little bit more about yourself, who you are, where you're from, how you identify, and anything you want to share?
Yeah, I am a writer and an activist, though I more often identify as an activist and an organizer, and writing is a medium for me. I think I jumped into it more so as a reader first, and just finding that books like the autobiography of Assata Shakur or Angela Davis's many, many works, or Mark Lamont Hill, or those works helped me understand the issues that I was grappling with. And I wanted to be someone who also helped others to understand things that I felt like I had the nuance and the grasp on. And the deeper that I got into the activism and organizing that I was doing, the more I felt like the movement needed better narrative building, better storytelling, a better pipeline for people to be both educated but then empowered to do something about that awareness, versus it just stopping at, I know how bad the world is and there's not much I can do about it, and just really staying solutions oriented. So that's a bit about me. And I try to live by a few mantras. Angela Davis always said, you have to believe that you can change the world, and you have to do it all the time. And that's something that I truly try to live by. And also Assata Shakur said, we have to be weapons of mass construction. And so I think those are two quotes that drive my ideology, where even if I'm working in a new issue area or on a new campaign, at the end of the day, am I addressing things by the root causes, but also trying to replace it with something better?
I love that. And I think one important thing to contextualize everything here, just for the sake of folks listening, I referenced this a little bit earlier, was introduced to a lot of these ideas by you. Like, I remember when we first started talking and I was like, what is abolition even? Like, what is this you're writing about? What are these things? And you were so like welcoming and inviting me to understand what it was and how I could do that too as a writer, and how that could be a medium that I was also interested in exploring, and never really had met anyone up to this point, being in Arizona, who was exploring it in the ways that you were doing it, right? Like understanding what it meant to be a journalist, but then also being an activist, but then also like really honing in on like speaking truth to power in all the ways that you wanted to, and not feeling, constricted to certain limits. So I just wanted to center that because, I mean, you are for sure one of the mentors that I feel like has pushed me to be in this world.
That means everything from you. Thank you so much, for real. That means so much. And I think especially, I just have to remember that I didn't know everything. Like, someone had to hold my hand. Someone had to recommend books and documentaries and nudge me and believe that I could know and do differently than I had been socialized to be. So I think if everyone can lead from that place, that we are all imperfect human beings trying to get it right. We are in some ways inevitably going to harm one another, but our job is to mitigate that and course correct that every chance that we get. And so I love to hear you say that, because now you're killing it and doing so many amazing things, and I'm on your, so it's really dope to hear. So thank you for affirming me.
No, of course. And I think that's like super important as we think about movements, and we'll get more into it. But you being such a leader and also young person who's like invited others to be part of it, and like have welcomed and provided the space for that learning to happen, right? Not necessarily like, and we encounter this in other sort of movement spaces where there's a lot of like pushback or resistance to like, oh, you don't really know what you're talking about, like why are you even here, kind of thing. And like you were never giving that energy like in any way to anyone. And I think that's something that like needs to be centered and understood, as like movements will only move forward if this kind of like energy is there. So
we got to be generative. And remember that like the goal is not to be like, how can I have the smallest group of people who have the perfect theory, but to say we need the widest group of people to fumble towards it and want to get it right and care enough to want to get it right and to take in that feedback, because we can't build the world that we want with like 50 people. I mean, not ethically, at least. Right. Like, I think if you're like Thanos trying to snap people away, maybe, but like ultimately what we're trying to do here requires a big umbrella. And I think that's really hard for people, even abolitionists, to really understand, like, ooh, I have to believe that I can organize beyond people who already agree with me and bring people in who are like, ooh, we have similar values and I just never knew that. So anyway, we could talk about this.
And on that note, like, how did you get introduced to this role? I know you mentioned some of the texts that you already started to explore, and like perhaps your upbringing really informed this, but like in the same way that I, came to you, how did you kind of get into this world and start to understand yourself as like being someone to fully embody what it means to be an abolitionist?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in some senses it was upbringing, but not in a traditional sense. Like, I didn't really grow up in a family of people who considered themselves activists.
Mm-hmm.
I did grow up in a family of like Black preachers and pastors, and the Black church has been a big community organizer. So I think there's been a lot of like natural love for direct services and community outreach and oration and, you know, using words to resonate with people and to either offer reprieve or to get people riled up, right? So I think that was something there. And then I think there were elements where I later learned more about my grandparents or my parents and how much that they were pushing back in different areas. But really, I went away to college and everyone was like, oh my gosh, she just like went to Yale and came back a Black Panther. And it was Yale radicalized me.
Wow.
I went to college. I graduated high school in 2012. And that year that I was graduating high school was when Trayvon Martin was killed. And so that was one moment. And then I think what was more radicalizing was George Zimmerman getting acquitted. Because Trayvon Martin getting killed, like unfortunately, seeing Black people getting killed wasn't necessarily like it was shocking because he was so young and because this was like a vigilante situation. But I, at that time, had so much faith in the criminal justice system to avenge and provide the justice that his family was seeking at that time, which was a conviction. And the acquittal was what really like felt like a gut punch. And I had to really reconcile what it meant to believe in this system that really was never designed to offer. I had to rethink what justice even looks like and whether this was a system that was able to give that to someone like us and what that would mean. So I'm going into college and I was a physics major at Yale, and Yale had been my dream school. And I get there and I'm like, oh, it's whiter and more class driven than I really thought, which is, I mean, now people are like, how did you not know? But my perception was very distant. It was not an intimate understanding. And so I'd seen Yale in shows like Gossip Girl and Gilmore Girls, and I didn't really understand what it was going to be. And then getting there and realizing that I didn't want to be in a lab all day, but I also didn't really trust the system at Yale to be educating me towards the work that I wanted to do. And so once I did realize that I wanted to be doing more activist work, it was sort of this also realization that Yale, like I am trying to do work that dismantles everything Yale is built to be.
Exactly.
So the Audre Lorde quote, the master's never going to give you the tools to dismantle the house. So I had to take what I could get, and I ended up learning a lot more from my peers and fellow activists and learning what coalition building looks like, what organizing across racial and ethnic groups looks like, and how to really strategize against billion-dollar endowments and major consequences in the same way that young people today are right now around the Gaza encampment. So, but I learned a lot during that time that really pushed me to understand that the criminal legal system was just insufficient. And to go back to books like The New Jim Crow or Slavery by Another Name also really hammered home that this is a system that evolved. And if what those in the 19th century were calling for was abolition and what happened was evolution, then the job was never finished. So we have to be abolitionists today. We have to abolish the idea that we can extract labor and wealth from Black and Indigenous and brown communities and build an empire on their backs. And that's what chattel slavery did. That's what criminal legal system is doing. That's what immigration detention is doing. That's what all of these isms are set up to do. And so that's how I really got into the space.
No, I appreciate you laying out the like journey of consciousness that's occurred, because I think what we often, again, are like, folks are hesitant to kind of share or really center is like, you're not going to be an abolitionist right away, right? It takes the understanding, the seeing, the acquittal, like things like this to happen for you to realize like the system's actually not designed to ensure that people are thriving and living like it's actually the opposite, right? And being able to like get to that point of like, I was actually wrong, right? I was a student. I didn't know any better. It wasn't until you become integrated into these spaces where you're really seeing, and people are kind of making it very clear, like this world or this society, this culture is not positioned to allow us all to thrive, right? But I really appreciate that you're centering like the consciousness takes time. And I think that's precisely what these conversations are for and how that happens.
Because I think right now social media rushes the process so much.
Mhm.
So people want to, something happens in the news and people want to respond to it immediately. I have to have a statement. I'm like, you're not the president of the United States. Like, you don't need to release like a press release every time something happens. And that's not to say that people shouldn't speak up.
Yeah.
But I think people feel this pressure to respond with such an immediacy that doesn't allow for ingesting what has happened. And I think that this happens on multiple levels. For people who are directly impacted, I think it means that we are constantly in this defensive mode and we're never getting to process and feel our feelings. We become desensitized and we internalize things and we don't know why we're angry and burnt out. But it's because we're consuming and responding and consuming and responding and not getting to build this proactive strategy. And then for allies, I think there's this fear based like responding that happens, which is like, I want to posture myself as someone who's getting this right. But in doing so, it's like, I'd rather be the first to respond than someone who's saying something because it needs to be said or doing something that needs to be done. And so again, I think that speaking up matters, but I think a lot of people settle for, reading a few carousel posts and not doing the deeper work. And it's like, I could not have come to abolition in that way at all. I grew up in a pretty low to middle class income, like Black and brown community in New York. The idea of a world with no police and prisons, I didn't know what the ACLU was before I went to college. Like we just got to understand that people are coming at these issues from very different angles. Some people grow up in families where they've been on like union front lines since they were kids and they know all that it is about that. But for me, it was like I did not know much about the organized philanthropic world. I knew about activism. I just thought that it was people volunteering their time and didn't really understand that there were national organizations dedicated to this work, let alone that there are national corporations and entities dedicated to the opposition, right? Like these are for-profit billion-dollar corporations that are not going to just be like, oh, Brea said we should stop, so we should stop. Like there has to be a real strategy around it. And I think giving people the time to say like, for several years, I was just reading and going to protests and going to teach-ins, but I wasn't trying to be the one planning them or teaching other people. But once I had taken enough in and felt like I had something to offer, then it was like, okay, I want to join in more leadership capacity and I want to write reading lists for other people and write articles and take this somewhere and not putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, and I think exactly how you're describing it and just hearing you express like identifying all these connections and you seeing here's the role that I want to play or I'm trying to play or trying to learn and see and understand, but then also drawing connections even with what you were alluding to earlier, like how different movements are very much so interconnected. And I think we talk about this a lot in a lot of the episodes, is that the movements don't exist in isolation, right? For us to talk about the criminal legal system and to remove that from immigrant detention and to remove that from environmental justice is like, again, causing this sort of detriment to what it means to build movements. But I think altogether, you're making it very clear that this journey for you has come to show up like the consciousness is developing through time. Like you're now, I think, definitely leading movements and at the center and showing people what it looks like and how to take action because there was a time where you were learning from others too.
Yeah.
Right? And 100%. I think there's a lot of value in like knowing how to show up and wanting to like assist others in building that. But getting to a point of like now you're developing new ways of thinking and how we're understanding the ways in which these different systems are interlocking. So, and I think that's precisely what
and that could be ebbs and flows. Like we can be forever students. So for example, in New York, I got to a place where, because that's where I'm from, I was heavily involved in planning and organizing. And then I moved to Atlanta. And I'm not going to come to this new state, this new city, this new context. I grew up in a state that was blue, albeit in a community, Long Island is very red. And so there were still things to navigate. But ultimately, like New York is a different place to organize in than Georgia. Union power alone is very different. And those are who I organized with a lot in New York. So just learning, when I moved to Atlanta, I was like, okay, I want to be voting in local elections. I want to be attending programming, but I just need to sit and watch and take in. I don't need to try and come and and lead someone else's movement. And I just tried to be someone who was donating where I could, attending where I could, and being a body in the room, and not being too full of ego to take that time and say that there are other ways for me to contribute right now than trying to be the mouthpiece. And the best thing that I can do is learn from the organizers here. So that's really helpful. But also to what you said about the interconnected movements, like, and I know we're going to talk about this later, but it was really important to me because, again, I was first really radicalized around the criminal legal system and also around class, because everything is relative. And going to Yale, you realize how true that is. Like, I grew up thinking I was middle class and then got to Yale and was like, oh, I'm poor. Okay.
Yeah, you realize that quick. Yeah.
I didn't know that it was possible for people to amass the kind of wealth that some of my peers and professors had. But then over time, that also translated to me thinking more critically about patriarchy and me thinking more critically about capitalism. And then me realizing that a lot of my racial justice work had centered around city experiences. But most Black people live in the South. Most Black people live in rural and suburban environments. Like, more than 55% of Black Americans live in the deep South. Yeah, but then I got to a point where I realized that a lot of the work that I was doing centered around a Black experience in the city. And again, that made sense because that was my experience. But realizing that there were so many perspectives that were being flattened, the reality that more than 55% of Black Americans live in the South, that live in rural and suburban environments, had a very different experience with all of the racial justice issues that we were talking about. And so what helped was feeling that I had a North Star or like a core ideology that it didn't feel like I was hopping around when I cared about different issues. It was that I acknowledged the intersection, that I could say, for me to care about the criminal legal system requires me to also think about what happens to incarcerated people in a natural disaster, what the quality of food is like, how that intersects with labor, what women in incarcerated, like, you know, you're thinking of all of the different intersections. And there's quite a few other campaigns that I've gotten to be a part of that have really helped me to see that. And again, it's such a great way when you acknowledge the intersections, you can build a bigger umbrella and bring people into the fold who want something more out of life and just want to feel like there's a movement working towards that and working towards that for them and their families too.
I think that was a big reason why, I mean, now even in the work that you're doing, and as I approach you and talk to you about it, is that you invite it so much in the sense of like, we aren't seeing things as singular, like, I guess, isolated issues, right? And I think there's like ways in which you're doing that now, whether that's as a writer or as an activist or as an organizer, like you're approaching it in all the ways. And so with that, I do want to tie in your book, and I think because it's precisely an example of what this is. If you want to read us the title.
Yes. So my book is called Rooted: The American Legacy of Land Theft and the Modern Movement for Black Land Ownership. It's a mouthful, but just remember rooted. That's
all that matters. Can you tell us a little bit about how you even came up with the idea of, like, one, wanting to address land theft and land justice as an avenue of, again, also understanding the criminal legal system, and how that just started to show up for you?
Yeah, it started not at all connected to any of the work that I was doing. It was really very family driven. My family has always loaned. What I knew growing up was that my family owned land in North Carolina, my father's side of the family. And that always felt really special to me. And we'd go there for holidays and family reunions and funerals and things like that. But it was always sort of a during the summer or during the break from school thing. And it was not really my full-time experience. And then my grandfather suddenly got sick in 2019 and passed away. And one of his last words was, "Don't sell the land." And so I just remember feeling like this mattered so much to him, for him to be thinking about it in this moment. And to feel close to him, I wanted to feel closer to the land. I'd also known that my grandfather had always been very into collecting and record keeping. He was always the family historian and always someone who really cared a lot about legacy. So when that person in the family passes away, you're like, okay, we don't want to vacuum, right? I want to make sure that this part of the family tradition continues on. So it just started as me doing genealogical history about my family for my family. And in finding out more, I knew that my grandfather had inherited about 6 acres of land from his parents. And my grandfather is one of 17 siblings. So each of them inherited that much land. So that meant that their parents had about 100 acres to pass on to their kids, which felt really impressive to me. Like, I'm just like, okay, this Black, pretty working class farming family was able to pass this land on to their kids. But then in doing the genealogical history, I realized that my family once had almost 600 acres. And so then being like, where did all that land go? And finding out the story and being like, oh, the land got put up for collateral and got taken over a $10 debt, or the land was bought out at a really low price by this company, or eminent domain, or USDA discrimination, or so many different things kept showing up. And so I felt the need to tell a story about Black landowners being unicorns, because we now live in a world where a country where less than 1% of American farmland is owned by Black people. That is a very scary stat to think about. And I just got to this place where I was like, in a country where Black people were forced to work this land, to not be able to benefit from it and have access to it centuries down the line feels very systematic. Yeah. And I wanted to add to the chorus of people who'd been saying that for quite some time. There have been a lot of Black Southerners and Black farmers who've been decrying this and talking about this. And I wanted to offer another addition to that, to say that there's so much love that we have for the land, and there's been a severed relationship, but that can be restored.
Wow, that's so impactful. I feel like, well, one, I had no idea that statistic was real. That is actually like super frightening. Like, how does one person, in comparison to, the population that was enslaved, that produced the world that we, or the country that we now live in, how that could still persist to this day, like knowing to this day. And I think that we talk about, reparations, and this is something we'll get into and how that shows up in your book. I think the ideas on like how land has been reproduced and how you've come to understand that it's then repurposed to cause other harms. One way in which, like, the building of prisons, I think that was something, as we were thinking about, like, that is also super startling. Like, how is it that there is a land? The question is not if it's there. It's just, what is it being used for, and who is it being given to, or what, private corporations are buying it to reproduce harm. I'm curious to know how you started to, like, in the discovery of these ideas, started to understand, like, wow, we're really being further criminalized, further pushed into these systems to, be captured in these facilities.
Yeah. I mean, again, so, there have been a few people who've done some really important research showing that right after emancipation, the expansion of jails and prisons, that the punishment that Black men in particular were facing was to spend a certain amount of months or years in a coal mine, or working in a sort of like industrial sort of space, or laboring literally on former plantations, was also very tied to the system of sharecropping in the South. And so ultimately, there is such a trend of realizing that America became a world power because the profit margin was unethically high. And once emancipation happened, and it was like, oh shoot, if we have to pay people a fair wage, we can't afford to make the same profits that we once did. We have to find a way to replace this free labor source. And it's not going to be free anymore, but if we pay for it through kickbacks to certain politicians or certain sheriffs or certain, like county offices and agencies that could ensure that legislation, so like legislation around trespassing did not really exist until convict leasing became a thing. And so you get Black men who are serving months in a mine for walking down a street that they weren't supposed to be on, or without permission, or just for these ridiculous crimes. And so that was one thing that had really helped me to understand that there was no real investment. I mean, we also hear about failed Reconstruction. So there was no real investment in saying, we have done serious harm to this Black community in this country, and we want to give them the the wealth that we have stolen back and give them a chance to be a part of this society. That's not what happened. So unfortunately, then what that means is that it's like, okay, well, what do we do with the former plantations? Like, we're still an agricultural economy. Someone has to work it. So Attica Plantation becomes Attica Prison, right? And like that happens across the South, that they don't even change the real full names. They don't even have the decency to change the names outside of replacing plantation with prison. Even now, the movement in Cop City, that land that was obviously once indigenous owned, was then turned into a plantation, then turned into a prison and work camp, and then went idle and became the Weelaunee Forest again, and is now being built. They're trying to build this big facility on it. But to know that was like, I refer in the book often to the land as like a fellow hostage, in that there was this forced relationship of the land being a site of oppression. But the land didn't do it to us, right? Like, people enacted that onto the land. And I think that's something that I've tried to come back to often, is that the site is, it's not like a static thing where a former plantation remains that way. They can be rebuilt, and the narratives can also be rebuilt and turned into something new and generative. And there's lots of cool projects like that happening.
Yeah. So can you elaborate a little bit more on what Cop City is, for folks who may have no understanding of what it is?
Yeah, so in Atlanta, and Atlanta is just one of dozens of Cop City sites and one of the more visible resistance spaces. But in Atlanta, there is a facility being built that would be a training ground for police officers and firefighters. And initially, this was presented to the community as a response to police brutality and 2020 uprisings, as sort of a, let's train the cops better. But in actuality, what the facility is, and when you look at the plans, it's a $90 million plan, mostly footed by taxpayers, to build a literal mock city for police to practice raids and arrests and all other things in. So it's not like I think when people first heard about it and were pushing back against the protesters, it was sort of like, well, you wanted better training. And it's like, first of all, we did not say that we wanted better training. We said we wanted a divestment and a reinvestment in other things. But anyway, that's its own conversation. But even if we did, this is a space to perfect the policing against, not to learn de-escalation or anything of that sort. And so literally to build this $90 million mock city that, number one, is going to destroy a natural habitat that has been called the lungs of Atlanta. It's a green haven, an enclave in the middle of the city that filters air, that has bodies of water running through it, which provide clean water to nearby residents. It's right in the backyard of the AUC, which are the HBCUs, Spelman, Morehouse, Clark Atlanta University. And so overwhelmingly, you're saying that you are going to put this giant facility in the middle of a forest, right in the backyard of these Black colleges and Black communities in Atlanta. And then you're going to funnel in, because it's not just to train Atlanta police. It's going to bring in police from all over the country and from partner police forces around the world, including the Israeli Defense Force, to train them in Atlanta. And so to bring this invading force into this Black city and to destroy a forest to do so on land that has already been used for the oppression of Black and Indigenous people, already stolen land, already a plantation, already a work site. Like, can the land not breathe? Literally breathe. And so the movement that popped up was called Stop Cop City. And forest defenders have been blocking construction and really resisting this and trying to get people to recognize this movement at the intersection of the abolitionist movement to end mass incarceration, the climate justice movement for people who are talking about saving the planet. We cannot do that if the few spaces of forestation are continued to be torn down for a playground for police. Like, it's just, and then on top of that, in a city with a lot of wealth inequality, where housing is through the roof, and instead of, if you're gonna tear down a forest to build housing that is affordable and to build spaces of recreation for young people and to build programs that are actually benefiting the citizens, then maybe we can have a different conversation. But citizens were not engaged in the process at an early enough stage at all. And so now have this facility being forced upon them, and everything from students to clergy to community organizers to parents have been decrying this movement. And it's been really frustrating to see a Black-led city, as far as political representation goes, really resisting the will of the people.
Yeah, wow. No, Cop City is perhaps one of the most extreme examples of what all the kind of reproducing of like continued colonialism and capitalism and all the forces coming together to create something that is inherently bad for everyone. And in this case, the only person benefiting or people is the state, and how it's reinforcing violence. I think as we think about how, like, again, environmental justice shows up, as understanding carceral systems show up, how have you come to understand like these ideas of reforms, this in this case seeming as an example of a reform that's like, oh, well, you asked for more training, like now we're giving it to you, even though, like you said, no one ever asked for it.
Right, exactly.
How do you understand people who, you know, are providing pushbacks with like, oh, well, these are efforts to provide reforms to state violence?
You know, the only people I will have that conversation with are Gen Zers or Gen Alpha. But everyone else, we had that conversation in 2014. We have body camera footage of Eric Garner being killed using a banned chokehold. The reform was to ban chokeholds. If Officer Pantaleo can use a move that is already banned and not face real consequences for it, what do the reforms do? So I gave up on those ideas that body cameras were going to save us. I also think that something that abolitionists really helped me to understand is, are we trying to stop police brutality, or are we trying to catch people in the act of police brutality? I don't need body cameras to catch more Black people dying so that we can continue to release the videos. I want Black people to stop dying. I want brown people to stop dying. I want disabled people to stop dying. I want queer people to stop dying all at the hands of police. And for that to happen, we need more than accountability on the other end. Now, I get that some people believe these reforms are going to be deterrents. But again, we have to say, how many body camera footages do we have? How many cell phone videos do we have? And the videos go viral, and there's an uproar, and there's a conversation, and pundits debated on MSNBC and Fox, and it keeps happening though. And so to me, I think it was really important that, and I think this might have been a 2020 campaign, but there was first a campaign that was put out around reforms and was called like 8 Can't Wait. And then the abolitionist movement responded and was like 8 to Abolition, because essentially the initial 8 Can't Wait list was a list of 8 reforms that would reduce police violence. But they were really centered on like reaction as opposed to prevention. And so 8 to Abolition was really focused on, how do we stop it at its track? Ultimately, police are responding to cases that they don't need to be responding to. How can we filter out and make people less dependent on 911 so that people get the support they need without an armed person with a badge showing up at their door? If people want de-escalation, how can we get people de-escalation? If people need mental health services, how can we get them that without sending a gun and a taser and a chokehold and a knee to their door? And I think that's something that I really want those who still stand by reforms to get, is like even the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which didn't even make it through Congress, but it was still, to me, the bare minimum. And I just felt like we can't continue to lean on incrementalism. We really have to take these bold, we have to understand that we have been investing trillions of dollars in our current system, and it has not worked. People do not feel safe. People are being over-policed, over-surveilled. People are being traumatized by the state.
Yeah.
And again, not feeling safer for it.
Yeah.
And so let's try something new.
Yeah. No, I mentioned the question on reforms is precisely to get this explanation for folks who are still like hesitant or on the edge of like, do I fully commit to something that is a world without those things, or should I still try and be open to it? And it's like, we have seen time and time again efforts for reforms to try to be implemented and for them to not result in the outcomes that we hope for. But I also mention it because I think that's precisely what you're alluding to in your book as well, of like no longer being in pursuit of like trying to change things, but rather understanding it at its core of, in this case, there is land that has been taken, and now it's what does a land back movement look like, and how those things kind of show up.
Absolutely, 1,000,000%. And I love that you just made that connection there too, because I think ultimately a lot of our issues, as far as where people talk about racial tension right now and things like that, is that we have avoided a wound for a really long time, and it's just bleeding through the little Band-Aid that we put over it, and it's going to only get worse if we don't address it. And so there are a lot of wounds that I mentioned as far as that, like the racial wealth gaps. I'm all for pay equity and I'm all for, but we cannot outwork racial wealth gaps. And so there's a certain level where we are trying to take the shortcut to justice and the shortcut to equity, and you just cannot. You have to go through it and make the real investment. And something that I talk about in the book too is that the biggest proposal that someone is making for reparations or land back is still conservative, right? Like, unless someone is literally saying give all of it back to Indigenous Americans, like, it is still conservative, because ultimately that is what is owed. And so anything less than that is really already a discount and a gift, and continuing to try to shortchange it and say, well, can we address climate change by giving white tech founders billions of dollars? No. They've created the problem. Why would you continue to fund them? Give land back to Indigenous tribes. Give land to Black and brown farmers. Give land to those who know how to be stewards, right? And you can't try and find the cheat. There's no cheat code. No, you got to give the land back. For those who don't want the land, they deserve some sort of financial restitution anyway. But ultimately, land back and reparations both have to happen, and they necessitate each other. I don't believe that they're mutually exclusive at all. I believe that Indigenous people, first and foremost, need land back, but also that my ancestors worked this land and I have a birthright to it as well. And that there is enough for all of us. And that's the other thing, is our ancestral relationships with land have always been a lot more abundant than what we now believe in under American capitalism. But there's enough to go around and for us to really have a deeper conversation. Because now if we talk about people who are forced to work the land without owning it, then we can also talk about Chicano farm workers. And then we can also talk about those who have always been saying we didn't cross the border crossed us. Then we can talk about land back that is even more expansive, and to those who are being labeled immigrants, but actually this is their homeland too. So I think the more that we dig into this history and know exactly what tactics have been used to push people off of land, then we can really dig into restitution. But until then, we're just pushing it off, and it's compounding interest.
Yeah, so in thinking about, for folks who are understanding ideas of reparations and are new to it and are trying to figure out how and if they have a say, how would you encourage people to understand that they rightfully so are entitled to know that they can be part of this movement to, have back what's rightfully due to them?
Right, exactly. Yeah, because I do think the narrative and the right-wing narrative is that it's a handout. And so there are some times where I see Black people who will say things like, well, I don't even want the reparations because I don't want, and it's it is, if someone steals from you, you're not being can you give me, you stole my bike, you stole my house, you stole my land. You have to return it. And remembering that if I had had that land in my family, it would have been passed on from generation to generation. It would have exponentially grown in value. And so it's not just I had an acre once. It's I had an acre at a time when that was really valuable, or I had however much land I had at a time when it was really valuable. So I think on the one hand, it's just important to reframe and remember that for Black people, I think a lot of the narrative around our relationship in this country is so based in victimhood. And there's been a lot of victimization and harm that has happened to us. But I think what has been really helpful for me on this journey is to remember that my ancestors and my elders are experts, right? Not just people who had life happen to them, but people who under incredible duress and against all odds learned this land better than the people who were forcing them to work it. Knew when a soil was too stripped and needed a break, knew to do crop rotation and cover crops, and we're using strategies that we now are repurposing and renaming and calling other things, but they were experts in stewardship. They were experts in tending to land and to building something for their families. And I think proof of that is the fact that between emancipation in the late 1860s to 1910, which is less than 50 years or just around 50 years, Black people went from being enslaved, treated as property, to owning 14% of farmland in the U.S. without a real federal investment in Black land ownership. And so to think that that is what we are capable of with so much stacked against us, imagine what is capable when we are not operating from a place of theft.
Yeah.
Like, imagine if we were never in a place where for decades, or, you know, I'm going to use one person's life. I'm going to use my family's lifeline. The person in my family who first bought land, his name was Brea Baker. That's my great-great-great-grandfather. And he's a Black man in North Carolina. And he bought land at a time where he had been enslaved longer than he had been free. Mm-hmm. He was a grown man when he was emancipated. And within 10 years of emancipation brought land. Like, that is such a... To know that story allows me to really operate from a place of like, all this shit is mine. I'm not allowed to say that.
Yeah,
okay. But just being like, I'm not asking for a handout. Like, my great-great-grandfather worked for that land, passed it on to his sons, who established schools for Black children and grew farmland for their families, who passed it on to more children and more children and more children. I still have a section of that, but I still should have more. And I'm not going to be apologetic about that at all in any way, shape, or form, especially because the U.S. military owns so many millions of acres of land in this country. The federal government owns so many acres of land under the guise of conservation, but a lot of that land is not being strategically used for conservation efforts. And so all of that to say, I'm not going to feel apologetic about wanting my little 100 acres over here when there are white men amassing hundreds of thousands of acres, when the federal government is amassing millions of acres, and when I know that I'm treating the land far better than they are. Like, even now, my wife and I, we have 1 acre of land in Georgia, and we've got 8 chickens and a beautiful garden, and it's just beautiful to see us be able to grow something, cook it, provide it for our family, to be low waste, to be sustainable, and to know that, man, imagine if we had inherited something more like this and that we were just continuing legacies that had been passed down. And just the last thing I'll say about that, a really great example in California is the Bruce's Beach situation.
I remember that.
Because had they had their land and their family, they should have been hotelier heiresses, right? Like the way that we think of the Hilton family. They should have been that. They had this beautiful Black resort in the Jim Crow time, and it was a like top destination for Black families wanting peace and joy and happiness, and to provide that while also building something up for your family is a really beautiful thing, and to have that snatched from under you. And so it feels like justice when the family got their land back, and I'm not decrying that at all. I think that's beautiful and needed to happen. But when you really think about it, justice would have been, again, interest for the money that they lost, right? Like the adjustment in how much that land value grew, you know, not having to pay taxes on it because they haven't had the chance to build it. Like, there's just so many ways that we can be more imaginative about land justice, is all to say.
Wow. No, I love everything you've just like clearly mapped out, from like thinking about here in California, Bruce's Beach is one example, your family's story, and just how I'm sure various families have similar experiences and how these things are reproduced in different areas of the United States and have made up majority of what is the country that is the United States. That the state is still purposefully, as you kind of mentioned this example of like through conservations, I'm assuming through like national forests or like through preserved lands that like are just there for the, you know, pleasure and entertainment of like, you know, now settler colonial Americans, as we all are, understanding that we're engaging with it too and sort of perpetuating these same cycles that we can also be part of undoing. And I feel like I'm curious to know, as I'm hearing all these like connections being drawn, how can we try to undo them? Like knowing that it's showing up in different regions, I'm sure majority of the areas that we all inhabit. what can people start to do to take action to either start to address it, understand the history in their localized areas, or take actions to understand reparations? How did you go about it, and how do you encourage others could?
Yeah, I talked about the genealogical history that I was doing, but that is something that is actually fairly easy to track. I mean, in some instances, like in Wilmington, North Carolina, or Tulsa, Oklahoma, where records were burned, of course, you have a different story. But ultimately, every county in this country has some instance of land theft. Obviously, from indigenous people for sure, but there are layers of land theft where there was violence first enacted upon the indigenous tribe that was first native to that land. Then the Black people who were pushed out of that space, like when you see an absence of a people, that is a response to something. And so I think one thing is that people can do that research. With Bruce's Beach, that initiative happened because in 2020, in response to George Floyd, there were a lot of protests in LA in solidarity, and an incredible organizer named Kevon Ward planned a event Juneteenth 2020 and said, like, why are we trying to be in solidarity with anyone else as if we don't have our own work to do? There was theft right here, and that family is still alive. Like, we talk about these things as historical moments, but sometimes the direct survivors of that theft are still alive and are just elderly. Sometimes it's their children or grandchildren who still hold that pain in those stories. And we can find those stories. Number one, Kevon Ward, after the success of the Bruce's Beach campaign, launched an organization called Where Is My Land that advocates for Black families getting restitution. And so I think one thing that people can do is just directly support the work of that organization, see if there are any active campaigns in your state and support them, because there are a lot. There is a parking lot in the University of Alabama, Huntsville, that used to be a family's land that was taken from them through eminent domain. There are so many, Walmart supercenters that are sitting on Black families' land, highways and lakes and all sorts of things. And the more that people know those stories, the more they can advocate for the descendants and the survivors, for at least there to be an accounting and an honest truth and reconciliation around it. But oftentimes there are local resources to either cede that land back to the local indigenous tribe, which again has been happening across California. Different parts of the redwood forests have been granted back to Californians by the respective agencies. So there's lots of ways to advocate, but it starts from knowing the stories.
Yeah.
We've got to keep them alive and keep them going and give people a reason to share those stories so that we can continue to make those campaigns more visible. Because again, there are a lot of nonprofits, a lot of countywide and state organizations and agencies that are in a position to either give land back or to create agreements with indigenous tribes. Like, for example, I've seen different forests and national public parks make agreements with indigenous tribes that they can forage and fish on that land that is ancestrally theirs. So again, the more that we know, the more we can advocate.
Yeah, I think as we're thinking about all the stories that I'm sure we'll learn more about in your book as well, how can we start to address like abolition as an avenue? I feel like you're alluding to like, oh, well, once we learn these stories and understand this history, then we can kind of think about next steps and move towards a world that does allow the land to be returned and does allow us to thrive on the environment. How can we fully understand that abolition is fully interconnected to everything you're talking about?
Yes, 1,000,000%. I think that most people's understanding of abolition really stops at no police in prison and not the existence of other things. And so I like to encourage people to go down rabbit holes with this. Like, for those who are listening, like, close your eyes. But just imagine, like, a world with no police in prisons. How would you feel safe in that world? Okay, you need more infrastructure for, like, well-lit neighborhoods. You need community organizers and organizations that are well spaced out throughout the neighborhoods for you to feel like there are enough hubs for entertainment and keeping people busy and out of trouble. For abolition to work, if people are not depending on police and prisons as much, then we need to have universal health care, because a lot of the reason that people call 911 are for mental and physical health related issues. What agencies do we have for domestic violence? What agencies do we have for sexual violence? But then it really does spread out, because even there are expansive ways of thinking of public safety. In Chicago, there are gun violence prevention groups that their main campaigns during the summer is planting trees because they have found there to be a massive correlation between hot weather and violence, and realizing that when people are extremely hot and living in areas with not a lot of shade, with an overpresence of concrete, that it allows tensions to boil over even faster. And that's like a sociological thing. There's also proof that lead in paint and other versions of toxins can also result in more aggressive behavior. So there are people like those in Flint who are working to understand those connections to say you can't then criminalize these kids who are having responses physically to environments that were not in serving them. All of these things then means that to address public safety, we got to plant trees. We got to have clean air, clean water, clean soil, paint that doesn't have toxins and poisons in it. We got to talk about food justice then, right? Because like a lot of survival crimes, and to eradicate those, a lot of people are doing this from a place of poverty and desperation. How do we address desperation? We gotta get rid of food deserts and food apartheid. How do we do that? We need to lean into agriculture. So it just requires us to think so much more expansively about our society and whether it's working for us. And anyone who travels out of the country, you'll do that. I remember just recently visiting Amsterdam and realizing that walking around at night, it was the safest I'd felt in a really long time. Realizing that a lot of infrastructure around healthcare and around public transportation and around public safety were very normalized. And that all of those things are products of financial investments. They're not all labeled abolitionist efforts, but ultimately someone has to think to say, what makes people safe, happy, have their needs met so they don't need to be threatened by someone else next to them, that we can lean on each other. And that's going to be pretty expansive. That's going to include reparations and land back. Because when we talk about Black and Indigenous populations and our issues with chronic poverty and homelessness and many other issues that are man-made issues that are not because we are inherently more likely to be illiterate or anything like that. So we've just got to be dreaming bigger and outside of the box of what constitutes public safety and not putting so many of our eggs in the basket of people with badges and tasers and guns and more in the understanding of different things make different people feel safe. What if we funded all of those things a lot better, you know?
I really appreciate your explanations of like what this world can be and how the literal planting of trees is one of those examples. And I feel like that's not something we've fully understood or talked about. And I never really considered that as a like key solution to understanding that this new world requires all the ways in which like our well-being occurs, and that includes the environment, that includes the land and just the physical environment that we embody. I would just love to hear your like final remarks on like what you have come to fully embrace now as an abolitionist that sees the overall interconnectedness of everything, you know, in a way that takes consciousness to get to. And I think leaving folks with the understanding of like, here's how you've come to understand it and how you're moving forward.
Yeah. This has been such a good conversation. First of all, thank you so much. I just think that I got to a place where my core ideology is that I want to live in a world where living beings are safe and healthy and living dignified lives. And I don't mean that to be exclusive to human beings. I want animals to have that. I want the plants around us to have that. And I think there's so much of me that when I was growing up, I laughed at tree huggers or hippie culture. But I really think that people are onto something to say that you can't believe in liberation and then want to dominate the planet around you. And our desire to subdue everything, to make everything more efficient, more fast, more productive has harmed not just us as human beings, but has harmed the planet. And for us to truly get rid of the racial capitalism that undergirds the criminal legal system, right? Because it only exists because someone found a way to profit off of it. We have to also do the same with we have to rethink everything. Every industry, every avenue, including the planet around us, is vulnerable to racial capitalism. And ultimately, my goal is to abolish racial capitalism. And in a very synthesized way, that means that I want people of every background to live a safe, loving, happy, and dignified life. And reparations and land back will get us there closest, but it will be a snowball, because I think once people see what's possible with those initiatives, we can dig into things like guaranteed income. And I mean, hopefully long before this, we also get decriminalization and exonerations, and there's just so much that's possible. But I just want us to dream bigger. And honestly, sitting in nature allows you to do that, because you realize it could all be so simple. This land is so beautiful, so breathtaking, and so miraculous. And for us to be focused on harming each other when there's so much beauty around us is like, there are better ways to use our time. I would much rather be in community with people who want to leave something beautiful in our wake, as opposed to leaving a torched field and hoping that future generations just figure it out.
Yeah, no, that's so, I feel the sort of groundedness and clarity that I've been like longing to understand as we think about these ideas that seem so big and so abstract, but really you're making it so clear. Like, it is really that simple. It is really as like simple as grounding yourself in the world and the environment, and just embracing just the world that we inhabit and making the most of it. So thank you so much, Brea. This has been so wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
In today's episode with Brea Baker, we better understood how land justice is a form of abolition. That's all for today. See you next time for Abolition Lessons.